Hello, I think we're live again. I'll just pause and invite my fellow panelists, Geoffrey and Layla, to switch their cameras and cameras on. Oh, great. Hello, good to see you. Well, good morning, afternoon, or evening, wherever you're joining us from, and very welcome to this second session of Out of the Wings in Focus, Black Playwrights of the Spanish and Portuguese speaking worlds, on this final day of the week-long Winter Warmer, celebrating and exploring theatre in translation, hosted online by our friends at the Omnibus Theatre in London. My name's William Gregory. I'm a translator from Spanish and a member of the Out of the Wings collective, and I'll be chairing this session focusing on Spain. Just before I introduce my guests, some Zoom housekeeping. This session is being recorded and will be made available on our YouTube channel in the coming days. The automatic captioning facility is available, and if you wish to turn this off or on, you can do so through your Zoom settings. Towards the end of the session, we will invite questions from the audience. Please use the Q&A function on your Zoom screens for this. You're very welcome to put questions in throughout the session as they occur to you, and I'll do my best to gather them together and keep track of them towards the end of the 45 minutes. You also have the option to upvote other people's questions. So I think that's the technical side all finished with. So now to the main event. Well, I'm a translator from Spanish, and I've translated a lot of plays from Spain. So I've been particularly keen to learn more about this topic. And I must say, I've already really enjoyed and appreciated being able to do so with the help of the books, blogs, and other writing and signposting of my two guests today. So I'm absolutely delighted to be able to have this conversation with both of you in this public forum. So to introduce my guests, my two guests are Layla Benitez-James and Dr. Geoffrey Coleman. Layla Benitez-James is an editor and translator based in Alicante, whose poems are forthcoming in Virginia Quarterly Review, Bennington Review, and the Latino Book Review. Poems and translations have appeared in Poetry London, the London Magazine, Hinchas de Poesía, the Acentos Review, Guernica, Waxwing, Revista Cocoro, La Galla Ciencia, and elsewhere. Audio essays about translation can be found at the Asymptote Journal podcast, and print essays have been published in Tenderly magazine and Europe Now journal. God Suspected My Heart Was a Geode, but He Had to Make Sure was selected by Major Jackson for the 2017 Cave Canem Toy, Dericote and Cornelius Eady Chapbook Prize, and published by Jaya Lai Books in Miami. Layla, a very warm welcome to you, and thank you for being with us. Dr. Geoffrey K. Coleman is an associate professor of Spanish at Marquette University, where he specializes in contemporary Peninsular Spanish and Catalan theatre and popular culture. He's published several articles on immigration, race, and national identity in Spanish theatre and popular culture in Catalan Review, Symposium, Estreno, and others. His first book, entitled The Necropolitical Theatre, Race and Immigration on the Contemporary Spanish Stage, published by Northwestern University Press in 2022, a copy here, I much recommend it, explores how the intersections of race and immigration manifest in Spanish theatre from 1991 to 2016. He's also working on his next book project, tentatively titled España Negra, The Consumption and Rejection of Blackness in Contemporary Spain, which explores the ways in which Spanish media, popular culture, and literature have portrayed Blackness from the early 20th century to present. And Geoffrey, a very, very warm welcome to you too. Very glad you're here with us today. Well, a little later in the session, we'll move to a more conversational mode. But to give us something to contextualize that discussion, I've asked Geoffrey and Layla to give us something of a presentation relating to this topic from their own perspectives. So without further ado, I'll hand over first to Geoffrey and then to Layla. So Geoffrey, please, the virtual stage is yours.
Thank you very much, William. Okay. Well, good afternoon, everyone. Good morning here from the United States. I'd like to begin by thanking Out of the Wings for this spectacular event, and especially to William Gregory for inviting me to take part in this, and thank you for the introduction. I'm going to speak briefly about the recent historical context of how Black people have been represented in Spanish theater as a segue towards the work of Silvia Albert-Sopale, the Afro-Spanish playwright whose work we will discuss during the rest of this panel. And just as a warning, there will be some graphic images and references in these slides. Up until the late 1980s, Spain was known as a nation of emigration, as millions of Spaniards left to other European nations or to the United States in order to escape the Franco dictatorship or in search of better economic opportunities. This trend reverses upon Spain's 1986 entrance into what we now know as the European Union. Spain's achievement of European status coincided with an economic boom put on full display in 1992 with the celebration of 4 major events. Madrid was named as the 1992 European Capital of Culture. Barcelona hosted the Summer Olympic Games. Sevilla, or Seville as it's known in English, hosted the World's Fair, whose theme that year was the Age of Discovery, to coincide with Spain's celebration of the 500th anniversary of Christopher Columbus's arrival to the Americas, though the Spaniards themselves would say discovery. And these 4 events not only put Spain on the map for Europe and the Western world, but also on the map for migrants from the global South looking for work, mostly in construction, hospitality, and agriculture in preparation for these events. And as such, the Patera invasion, in quotes, began. Pateras are small boats packed with migrants that attempt to cross the Mediterranean Sea to reach mainland Spain, or are also known as cayucos in the case of boats that traverse the Atlantic Ocean to reach Spain's Canary Islands. This trend began in 1991 in mainland Spain and 1994 in the Canary Islands. This photo that you see taken by Mexican photojournalist Narciso Contreras captures the death of migrants who died likely of dehydration or starvation during their journey across the Mediterranean. However, the largest cause of death is drowning from boats that are capsized at sea or when migrants attempt to swim to shore and are pulled by the currents. As you can see from this map, there have been thousands upon thousands of maritime deaths as a result of this migratory phenomenon. The magnitude of these deaths draws an eerie parallel to the Middle Passage of the transatlantic slave trade, though in this case, most of the Black bodies voluntarily made the journey across the sea. And throughout the 1990s and early 2000s, Spain was the destination for many of these boats. And it's worth noting that in 2004, Spain had the highest rate of immigration in the world after the United States. Though these boats make up a very small portion of that, is something that we need to take into account. In recent years, Italy, Malta, and Greece are receiving the brunt of this migratory flow and the tragedy that comes with it, starting in around 2015 with the Syrian refugee crisis. And as Spanish waters and land entry has been heavily policed, migrants from sub-Saharan Africa are entering the Mediterranean through Tunisia and Libya to attempt to reach these nations further east in the Mediterranean. The first play in Spain to portray this migratory journey is Ignacio del Moral's 1991 play La Mirada del Hombre Oscuro, The Dark Man's Gaze, which was later adapted to the film Buana in 1996. This play follows the tragic story of Ombasi, a Black African migrant who had washed up upon the shores of Spain and encounters a Spanish family on the beach. In the prologue to the play, Del Moral states that he was inspired by a photo of the bodies of 2 African immigrants who had died attempting to reach Spain, a sight that was all too common in Spanish media in the early 1990s. Thus, in an attempt to humanize immigration, his play instead portrays what would have happened if one of the men had survived the journey. However, Ombasi too dies at the end of the play as a homeless man in the Madrid subway, drowning in a puddle of filth as he falls asleep due to a flu-induced fever. And so this play established a narrative motif in which the journey of Black African migrants always ends in their death, a conclusion also apparent in the 13 other plays that have since followed listed on this slide. And in 13 of the 14, these follow the cases of Black men. However, there is one by Malco Arija Martinez, which is entitled Equa Perdida en el Tiempo, that follows the story of a Black woman. And this is the discrepancy in the representation has to do with the fact that within Black migration to Spain, it's about 80-20 in terms of men versus women. And so there is a realistic representation of who is coming into Spain. In addition, as Frantz Fanon states in his iconic book, Black Skin, White Mask, Black people become phobogenic objects, right, that inspire fear, that they strike into the personal and collective imaginaries of white people. It is this trend of Black death that inspired me to write my first book, The Necropolitical Theater, Race and Immigration on the Contemporary Spanish Stage. Deriving from Achille Mbemba's concept of necropolitics, I conceptualized the didactic nature of Spanish immigration plays as necropolitical theater, one in which the immigrant is transformed into the fictionalized enemy, whose non-whiteness is incompatible with Spanish society and national identity, and therefore a threat to the Spanish state. And thus audiences are taught that the Black body is antithetical to Spanishness, which we know not to be true, given that there are millions of Black Spaniards in Spain today, the vast majority of whom are not immigrants, but rather citizens. In the conclusion of my book, I state that Spanish theater must shift away from the necropolitical towards a convivial theater, one that envisions racialized people or people of color as part of the national fabric while still addressing the issues of race and discrimination. However, given that white Spanish playwrights have spent the last 30 years writing storylines that portray Black people as perpetual migrants that can never achieve Spanishness, let alone live at all, Black Spaniards are now telling their own stories. And the first play to do so is Silvia Albert Sopales' 2016 play, No es País para Negras. This is not a country for Black women, an autobiographical journey of her life as a Black woman born and raised in Spain. She has since produced 2 more plays, Blackface y otras vergüenzas, Blackface and Other Shameful Things, which explores Spain's traditions of Blackface and racist iconography, and her most recent play, Pareo de Paramra, Stop Stopping Me, which critiques the racial profiling of Afro-Spaniards who are constantly stopped by the Spanish police for their DNI or national identity card to prove that they are citizens or at least documented migrants. And I'd like to conclude with a clip from No es País para Negras that I feel truly captures the current Black experience today and the struggles therein. I will show the clip and then I'll show you the text afterwards.
Negra soy, negra, española, vasca, catalana y olé. Y en mis 40 años de vida me han preguntado si soy dominicana, congoleña, brasileña, puertorriqueña, cubana, neoyorquina, francesa, portuguesa, pero jamás nadie nunca me ha preguntado si soy de aquí. Negra, sí.
Unfortunately, there's still a cognitive dissonance regarding who can be Spanish. Race alone excludes Sylvia despite having been born and raised in Spain, despite considering herself to be Basque, Catalan, and Spanish, and speaking all 3 of these languages. This was an issue for her in the 1970s and 80s as a child and continues to be an issue for many Black Spaniards today. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much, Jeffrey, for that really clear and very sort of striking historical and present-day contextualization. And as you point out, into or out of or both that context comes the work of Sylvia Albert and I think more of a context of other writers not necessarily working in theatre, but also writing from similar experiences. And that's a very neat segue to ask Layla to speak to us, because I know that this is something that amongst your various work you've been taking an interest in. So over to you, Layla. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, William, and Out of the Wings, everyone, for organizing, and thank you, Jeffrey, for this conversation. I'm going to first share a very brief interview that I did with Sylvia. And then I'll talk about it a little bit after. ¿Qué es lo que espera de la actriz que desempeña en el rol de Sylvia en una producción traducida? En este caso, en inglés.
Pues a mí me gustaría que la adaptase a su realidad, ¿no? Que hubiese una adaptación de ese texto, que no fuese solamente interpretar las palabras, porque esta obra es una obra de creación que pasa por el cuerpo y por las vivencias mías. Entonces, lo que me gustaría es que esa actriz hiciera suyas esas palabras, o sea, y las acercase a su realidad histórica y de ese momento de su vida también.
So no tan literalmente está.
Exactamente, sí.
Okay. ¿Y qué temas que se pierda en una traducción? Sobre todo si es algo que va a adaptarse muchísimo, es algo que tema que pierde.
Pues mira, nos pasó que cuando estuvimos en Múnich haciendo la obra, al traducirla al alemán, estaba el lenguaje políticamente correcto, ¿no? Entonces había palabras que no se decían, que no se podían decir. Creo que es como negro, Svanches, algo así, ¿no? Ellos tienen como el término políticamente correcto de decir negro, pero no es, no tiene que ver con la realidad de la pieza, ¿no? Entonces, con la corrección lingüística, era muy curioso porque la corrección lingüística hacía que yo misma no pudiese utilizar las palabras. Entonces, no llega igual al público, ¿no? Es una cosa como que... Y se pierden matices, se pierden muchos matices de lo que se está hablando si no se puede utilizar ese lenguaje, que es una discusión a tener, porque una cosa es que utilices el lenguaje de personas racistas de manera ofensiva, y otra cosa es que sean personas racializadas, afrodescendientes, las que utilicemos ese lenguaje como denuncia de cómo hemos sido interpeladas, ¿no? Entonces, esa es la parte que a mí más me preocuparía.
¿Y tienes un público ideal o es todo el mundo?
Para mí es todo el mundo, pero todo el mundo de verdad, ¿no? Me gusta mucho que venga a ver la pieza gente afrodescendiente, gente negra, por cómo la viven, por cómo la sienten, por lo que les aporta y lo que a mí me aportan en sus devoluciones. Y me gusta mucho que venga a verla el público más blanco en general, porque de repente se encuentran con una realidad que no han conocido, ¿no? Y las personas racializadas también, ¿no? Aparecen, la escuchan y se sienten interpeladas igualmente. Entonces, en verdad, es todos los públicos. Sobre todo me gusta mucho la gente, cuanto más conservadora, mejor, porque creo que es el público que más se revuelve quizás o que más lo siente en sus carnes.
Sí. Y que más necesitan también.
Totalmente.
Ya. Y también, ¿cómo se siente en cuanto a la constante referencia a los Estados Unidos? Y como el modelo y el referente en esta conversación de la lucha antirracista.
Claro, yo creo que eso es un trabajo que estamos realizando aquí para que ese no sea nuestro paradigma, que no sea la meta a conseguir, pero realmente es una referencia muy importante. Es muy importante porque es a nivel global, ¿no? Que todo el mundo está mirando continuamente a Estados Unidos y entonces ahí sí que estamos intentando virar la mirada y mirar a otros países y mirarnos hacia adentro, ¿no? Quizás, y esta cosa de poder adaptar quizás los modelos, ¿no? Pero también es innegable que hay una avanzadilla, ¿no? Que son muchos años más de lucha la que existe en Estados Unidos. Entonces puede servir mucho de camino en guía. También puede servir mucho para saber qué camino no hay que seguir, ¿no? Eso, como esas dos ideas. Yo realmente prefiero que miremos hacia nosotros porque son realidades muy, muy diferentes, las realidades de las personas afrodescendientes aquí que de las personas afroamericanas. Entonces siempre es intentar que podamos mirar, ok, pero siempre intentar volverlo y ubicarlo. ¿Qué tiene que ver eso con nuestra realidad? Y ver que hay veces que tiene que ver y otras que no tiene que ver, pero siempre hay como que volver aquí, que volver aquí, que volver aquí, a hacer ese ejercicio.
Yeah, so I was really happy to be able to talk with Sylvia about her work. And while I normally live in Alicante, I've been in Scotland since January 1st. I decided to fly over from Spain on Brexit Day, oddly enough, and our stay has been unexpectedly or expectedly lengthened because of the pandemic, but it's been really amazing and great for connecting to more writers of the diaspora who I wasn't aware of, coming from a more US-centric background. And so I actually wanted to mention first this issue of Gutter, which is issue number 21, which was a Black, Asian, and minority ethnic, a BAME issue of Gutter. I would say a POC issue of Gutter. And in it, the Scottish Macker, the Scottish poet laureate Jackie Kay, says something that I really loved. And she's talking about a biographical work that she wrote that was adapted for the play. And afterwards, people kept coming up to her and saying, "Thank you for telling my story." But these were wildly different people. And so she says, you can't set out to write a universal story. You can only be particular. And you can hope that that very particularity makes the story universal for lots of people, but it comes from the particular. And my focus has been looking at how translation can be used to connect the diasporic experience, and especially a feminine diasporic experience, and trying to trace where the limitations of that shared experience live and where they are. And one of the things that really surprised me as a translator, but like really delightfully surprised me as a creative writer and as a lover of hybrid texts, was that Sylvia talks about preferring that in a translation of this specific work, that an actress would dictate herself how the work is translated and bring in her own personal experience. Like, this to me is like extremely radical as a translator. I would never, but if the author herself is asking for this, I think it would be a really beautiful thing to do. And so rather than there being an anxiety about things being lost in translation, there's almost an aggressive kind of gaining of different experiences so that the work translates or lands to the audience in a truer way. And I saw the play in 2016 in Madrid. And so I was part of that audience that she's talking about, who are confronted by those harsh realities, but also really comforted to see my own story played out. And Jeffrey, I love that you showed that clip, because thinking about different experiences coming from Texas, I was also often asked, like, where are you from? Where are you really from? And there's another book by a woman, Ser Mujer Negra en España. And this is she opens with this, like, for the color of my skin, I have been Colombian, I have been Brazilian, I've been Cuban, I've been everything but Spanish. And so there's a lot of joy sometimes in somebody just saying that on stage and having that audience reaction. But this push and pull between shared experiences also has its limitations. And in my own notes, I was calling it a kind of Proust's Oreo problem. And I mentioned in another panel last year that in my first translation workshop, we compared English translation of Proust's Madeleine episode. And my professor wanted to emphasize how we could, as translators, go too far in trying to make something fit a target language. And so she talked about how we would never translate Proust's Madeleine into a chocolate chip cookie or an Oreo to get at the nostalgia of the United States and to center it that closely. But as the only Black mixed race person in that workshop, the word Oreo even landed really differently for me. And I thought about its racial connotations. And since then, there have been several other experiences that have led me to question some of my own assumptions of shared experience. Even as was mentioned in the other panel, they saying America when we mean the United States and not talking about all the Americas. And so lately I've been thinking about how I can decenter the United States, or at the very least be more conscious of its centering when I'm translated between Spain Spanish and US English. Even as US-based terminology and experiences and figures, such as James Baldwin and Angela Davis are so important to the conversation. And last year, I read a really great novel called Queenie by Candace Carty-Williams, and the main character's stepfather in this instance of bullying calls her a bounty, which, like Oreo, is white on the outside and brown on the outside. And I'd never heard that before, and since then I've kind of tracked a lot of different, of these slurs in different languages, and so it's something that I'd like to look into more, and a conversation for another day, or maybe we'll get into it a little bit now even, is how careful we have to be, I think, when we translate these kinds of terms. And even in the English translation for Sed Mujer Negra, some of the phrases I think are harsher in English than they are in Spanish, and vice versa. And so it's a really interesting thing to talk about where the balance might be found. And even in my own translation of the interview, I was finding myself, making choices that were maybe a little leaning towards the US rather than the UK, or rather towards Europe. And so maybe we could talk about that a little as well. But yeah, thank you very much to you both, and I'm looking forward to the conversation.
Thank you very much, Layla, and thank you very much to both of you. And there are so many threads to start delving into there that I hardly know where to begin. But I will begin, I think, briefly at sort of at the end, because we think often about translation. We think about reception, those of us who are translating into English, and we've been imagining what a production of this play might be like in English, but as far as I'm aware, there hasn't actually been one. But Jeffrey, I believe this is one text that you've used with your students. Yes. In the United States. So we may have a very small sample of people, at least in North America, who've experienced this play from outside of Spain. And I wondered if in that mini sample, there is anything you could share with us.
Yes, definitely. I think one of the things that comes up with students, particularly for students of color, is this, they grapple with exactly the clip that I showed, right? This notion that someone could be from a country, speak the language, it's their native language, and no one can conceptualize them as being from that place is disorienting for all of my students, but particularly for the students of color, right? Like, Black people have been here longer than the United States has been in existence. So you could never see a Black person in New York or Chicago, or wherever, and think they weren't from the US, right? And the same thing I would say, I have family in London, right? And they are Black British, and no one would assume that they weren't British, but that still happens in Spain and several other European nations as well. And so that's a very difficult thing to discuss, is that race, language alone does not allow you access to the nationality, right? That race actually trumps language in some cases. And that's very sad, and students are kind of taken aback by that. The other thing actually has to do with food that Layla mentioned. So in No es país para negras, Sylvia makes references to, for example, conguitos, which is somewhat like M&Ms, but without the shell, that has a very long racist iconography and history. Colacao, which is kind of like Milo or Nesquik, that also had a very problematic history and racist iconography, and how those foods that are very popular in Spain and almost nostalgic affect Black Spaniards, right? So little Black children today are called conguitos because they're cute, not necessarily taking into account that that's dehumanizing them at the same time. And so those are conversations that I've had to have with students. And the idea of Oreos did come up in class once, that there are terms that we have in the US that are connected to food that are used similarly to dehumanize the experiences of people of color. And so, yeah, students love the play. And on some occasions, I've been able to invite Sylvia to come speak to my students, and they love that because they're just like, wow, she is Spanish. Like at first they read the text and they're like, oh yeah, this Black Spanish woman. But then meeting her, they're like, oh, her accent. And it's like, yes, she is from Spain. Like they have to kind of drop all of their assumptions, and that's fantastic to see.
Thank you. Yeah, and it was really great to hear from Sylvia. So thanks very much, Layla, as well, for arranging that interview. I hope maybe we might get her around the Out of the Wings table one day. Thanks very much for that. Thinking about reception here, sort of theorizing what reception might be like here in the UK. I think obviously very, very important to recognize that I can't speak from the lived experience of someone who experiences racism either here in the UK or in Spain. But reading the play in the bilingual edition, which I have to thank Layla for signposting me to, by the way, and it's published by KRK, or I should probably say KRK Ediciones in northern Spain. Before I read or saw the play, I think I came to it expecting perhaps to see an experience that from the British point of view might be, as it were, so extreme an experience of racism that it might allow one in the United Kingdom to, as it were, rest on one's laurels and sort of say, oh, it's so terrible in Spain, thank goodness it's not like that here in the United Kingdom. But actually, many of the experiences that Sylvia refers to in the play are, I think, very recognizable to those experiences that are described in the UK, notwithstanding what you said, Jeffrey, about the acceptance of people as Black British. So when Sylvia refers to that question, no, but where are you really from, for example, when the young Sylvia meets her white boyfriend's family for the first time and is subjected to racist jokes that she's just expected to laugh along with because it's some sort of perverse way of being friendly. If that's well, there's no clean way to describe that. But one thing that particularly struck me that felt really pertinent to the UK at present was Sylvia makes reference to a debate about a statue of a slave owner in Barcelona, and how the people who complain about that are, by some quarters, dismissed as sort of troublemakers with a chip on their shoulder. And the young Sylvia is also confronted directly with the allegation that there is no such thing, as you've said, as a Spanish person, no such thing as a Black European person, and that she has no history in this country, potentially at all, or at least previously to a particular date. And in the UK right now, there are figures in our culture, and indeed our very own Minister of Culture, who seem to be pushing back quite strongly against those historians and artists who are telling the story of the Black experience in the United Kingdom and dismissing that storytelling as either rewriting history or doing Britain down. So notwithstanding Sylvia's desire for a translation or a performance in the UK to represent the experience of the actor who might perform it, I felt there were many elements in the play that were very recognizable, certainly perhaps in a European context is the way to think about it. But I wonder, Layla, what your response is to that, given that indeed you had that conversation with Sylvia and she almost had the opposite feeling about how the play should be done. And we always navigate, don't we, as translators, between this complicated idea of, oh, there's an over there that we're translating from, and there's an over here that we're translating to.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, as I have mixed feelings about it, really, because if somebody was to translate it with another actress really put in there, and I was going to bring up too, you know, I mean, it's the play is in her own experience, but like to the extent where at one point she says, my name is Silvia Albert Sopale, the Black woman to my friends, Chivita to my mother. So like there are instances where it is just like, it is her, you know, there's no boundary between the writer and the performer. And so it's interesting to think of another actress doing that and putting in her own name. And that's like in some ways very beautiful. But some of what is so exciting about the book as well is to see the flavor, or the, you know, the translation of the play, to see the flavor of Spain. And a little bit like that other book, like Ser Mujer Negra en España, just for people outside of Spain to know what the condition in Spain is. And I love that Jeffrey was bringing up those other, the colacaos and the conguitos, because I think it's really important to know that this isn't, it isn't so much in the past, you know, it's not, there used to be racist candies. It's like, they're still on the shelves. Like, you know, every time I go to the supermarket, I'm confronted with that little, it's kind of like a little, almost like a blackface cartoon character. And that's just like a completely normal thing. And so I think in some ways, if you were to translate it and perform it the way she's suggesting, a lot of really important ideas would be lost, and it would just become a new text. So I guess my own personal strategy, if I was going to help put on the play, would be to kind of do both, or to with the program to give out the translation so that you could see what it was in the original, even if you were going to put it in that different context.
Thank you. I can see we've got a question that's come in, and actually it sort of links to something that I was interested in perhaps touching on, which is, Jeffrey, your notion of the convivial theatre, which our questioner asks, does it have direct links to that idea of convivencia? And I wanted to ask you perhaps a compound question about whether or not, since you've written the book, you see that convivial theatre emerging, and whether or not, to extend it, maybe that we can think of an idea of a convivial translation of theatre, and indeed a convivial version of how we talk about Spanish theatre outside of Spain.
Yeah, so the notion of convivial theater actually does not come from convivencia, but rather from, there's a theorist, Argentine theorist, Jorge Dubati, who has this notion of el convivio teatral, in which he understands that theater is a space that brings random people together at a random point in time to see a play, right? And that space has a purpose that only those who are in that space at that time can understand, right? And so if we look at using theater as a social movement, then we need to be more intentional about what is occurring in that convivial space, right? And so if we are constantly pushing forth messages about death, then that is not convivial, right? It's going against the notion of life for other people. And so rather than it being a necro or political or deathly space, that it needs to be one that is more lively, that it takes into account all of those who are involved within Spanish society, whether they're Black or of Middle Eastern descent or Asian descent or what have you, and people with disabilities, etc. That all of those different types of representation need to occur on stage. But for the purposes of my book, I was talking more about racialized groups, right, and how they need to be portrayed in a better light, but and not continuously as migrants, right, but as people who are citizens, right? Immigration is still occurring, but we now have second, third generation Black, brown people in Spain, right? So we can't continuously talk about them in the same ways. I guess in regards to translation, I think that I would think of it in terms of, for example, the statues that were mentioned. So the statue in Barcelona of Antonio López y López was actually taken down recently. And the plaza that is named after him in Barcelona was renamed after an African migrant who died in a detention center, if I remember correctly. And so, yes, there is what some may consider a rewriting, but it's also coming to terms with the historical legacy of slavery and anti-Black racism, in the same way that in UK, was it Bristol, where they pushed the statue into the river, you know,
Yes.
which was a fantastic image. I feel like that's an event in and of itself that maybe if this play were to be translated, then instead of the Antonio Lopez y Lopez statue, it could be that statue from Bristol, right? And this kind of taking over the monument and taking over the monumentality of anti-Black racism and what that means to Black people in the UK would be the way to do that. Thank
you very much. I'd like to turn, Layla, to your question about the translation of racist, racialized language, those strong terms, because I think it is really important, and it takes on a particular kind of importance when we're also speaking, embodying those words in a theatre space. And certainly, there's perhaps no easy answer, and as we say as translators, it's all about the context, isn't it? But certainly, again, as curiously, like as a gay man, I find it fairly easy to translate homophobic language, for example, because I know what that experience is of either being on the receiving end of it, either directly or indirectly. But I'm not a person who experiences anti-Black racism or any racism for that matter. So I personally, as a translator, find it difficult when I'm confronted with that sort of language, and I fear making mistakes, and I'm sure I have made mistakes on occasion. Without turning this into a give me an advice session, because that's not what I mean by the question, but what are your thoughts, Layla, on how do we grapple with this sort of language, and in particular if we're thinking about a theatre space?
Yeah, no, I absolutely love that question, and I think it's an important one. You know, it's interesting, and I'm really glad that I revisited this translation, because originally I was thinking about having a conversation with the translator as well, and I'm glad that it ended up with being with Sylvia herself. But I think this is a case where the identity often of the translator is really, really important, or at least getting an outside reader. And I think it's a great parallel to think about homophobic language, because when you're queer yourself, you know that there's some terms are worse than others. Some terms have a history of violence with them. You know, there's some things that somebody could say to me and it would be very annoying, but I wouldn't fear for my life. And I think that's a really important nuance to have. So especially in the case of this translation, there were some times where it just felt like it was a little bit too violent, or a little bit too like stepping over a line where I think that it was, you know, I'm not sure that a person of color looked, a native English speaker, a person of color looked at the translation and kind of got that balance. And I think that would absolutely also be true for something that was using homophobic language. And I wanted to bring up another book, which is 7 Methods of Killing Kylie Jenner by Jasmine Lee Jones, which was London-based. And I don't think there's a translation into Spanish. It's pretty new. But it is really great. But there's an intersection of race and queerness in the book. But what's in the play, and something that's interesting is that in the play itself, she's using memes to convey a lot of like the dialogue. A lot of the dialogue is done in tweets and using the Twitter sphere, but it's also in memes. And in the notes for production, it says that the actresses playing the main characters are to enact these memes. And so it would be very, very particular for the people playing it. And then I would assume also, if you're translating it, for example, into Spanish, you would just leave that meme as the meme, even if it's not as recognized or German or Chinese or anything like that. You know, the memes are the memes. And so there's on the one hand, you know, there's also the idea that you could also just leave the terms in their original and put them in italics or something like that. But for me, yeah, I think the best thing would be for a translator of color or a translator from the group that term is used against to have a read over the shoulder and to make sure that the register is right.
One thing that I would just add to that, that I've been wondering about a lot in this conversation is the term negro, right? In Spanish can be positive or negative depending on the tone in which it is used, right? If it's in a negative way, it can mean the N-word, but in a positive way, it's a term of endearment for Black people. And so in the play, No Es País para Negras, it oscillates between the two throughout the play. And so I haven't had a chance to see a translation of the play, but I'd be really interested to see if there were any slip-ups in the positive versus negative connotations, because that could completely change the interpretation of a scene or the emotion that Sylvia was trying to give off with that play on words.
Well, it seems to me, based on that conversation, that this is a play that is ripe for a wonderfully collaborative approach between writer, translator, and performer, director, performer, or performers even. Who knows? There's so many ways to perform a dialogue that's written with one voice, but that can perhaps be performed by many. Who knows? Unfortunately and unbelievably, our 45 minutes are up, and I feel like we've only just got started. But maybe that's a good thing, because maybe this is a conversation that continue. And I've really enjoyed the opportunity to talk to you, and briefly in advance of today, but very much today. And may I say, I hope that this is not the last time that Out of the Wings and your paths cross. We'd very much like to see you, and indeed all our guests today, around our virtual or indeed physical table at some point in the future. So please stick with us. But thank you to you both hugely for this conversation and your insights into this topic, which is so important, I think. So thank you very much.
Thank you, William. Thank you, Layla.
Yeah, thank you both.
We'll now take a 30-minute break, but please do join us again at 5:15 London time, that's 17:15 GMT, when my colleague Dr. Almiro Andrade will be joined by Ginha Moraes, Dr. Eunice Ferreira, and Dr. Ramiro Silveira for a session focusing on Afro-Lusophone theatre. And also please stay in touch with us at Out of the Wings. You can find full information about our work at our website, ootwfestival.com, or via the various links and social media accounts you'll see on the slide during the break. Thank you once again to my guests this afternoon, and thank you all very much. And we'll look forward to seeing you again soon.